Vanitha is an illustrious and inspirational academic, author, and activist who has made remarkable contributions to the field of literature and grassroots activism, especially revolving around the theme of gender and sexuality. Having done her graduation and further studies in the literary rhyme, she extended her interest in this vocation through combining philosophy and social revolution with literary form to produce volumes of poetry, fiction, and other various non-fictional tracts. Some of the distinguished titles accredited to her name are Memory of Light, Gender, Sex and City, Urdu Rekti Poetry in India, Love Rights, Same-Sex Marriage in India and the West, and more. Dr. Vanitha has extensively researched and actively advocated for the rights and representation of the LGBTQ community, as well as various feminist movements. She had also co-founded Manushi, a journal about women and society, in 1978 to give a voice to particularly these issues in public domain. A devout academician throughout her career, she now teaches English literature and world culture at the University of Montana. However, there is ceaseless encouragement to be drawn from looking upon her work in all walks of life. We are truly honored to have you, ma'am, and extend you a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
I'll start with the first question. Your contribution to literature has been enormously variegated and profoundly influential. From volumes of Rekti poetry to novels dabbling into Hindu philosophy, as well as social issues to promoting unconventional ideation and writing through Manushi, you have gracefully aced all forms of art. In your higher studies, you've chosen English literature as a field of inquiry and continue to engage with it as a teacher. How seminal a part has it played in your understanding of social issues, inspiring you to vicariously engage with them throughout various mediums you have used so far?
Yeah, my doctoral thesis was on Virginia Woolf, on sexuality and marriage, and Virginia Woolf, Love and Marriage. And I think that was the first dissertation from Delhi University's English department, which was on the topic of same-sex love, basically. And then I wrote an essay on Shakespeare, on love between women in Shakespeare. And then I wrote a book called Sappho and the Virgin Mary, Same-Sex Love and the English Literary Imagination. And I've continued to work on English literature and in recent years on the connections between English literature and Indian literature. For example, how Indian texts influence writers like Thoreau and so on. Yeah.
You know, when we define things like sexual desires or attraction or love or attachment, or like just put a specific definition to these terms, which are rather very interpersonal in nature, how do you think these ideas engage when we talk about them in any gender or sexuality context?
Well, I would make a distinction between some of them. And when I co-edited the book Same-Sex Love in India, we distinguished between love and desire. You can love someone and they can be the primary person in your life. And there have been cases like this where you live together, whether a man and a woman or two women or whatever, two men. You can live together for 50 years, but you may not have any sexual relationship. Virginia Woolf and her husband were like that, you know. So desire is somewhat different from love. You can also have sexual desire for someone, and as we know, and have many interactions, sexual relationship with them without loving them. You might love someone else, or you might not love anyone. So that is very clear in life and in literature as well. And when you examine particular cases or particular situations, you see that there's a difference between those things. Right? Yeah.
Okay.
They can overlap, but they may not overlap. Yeah.
Okay. Would you agree that the social construct around the behavior of particular gender is also reflected in associating certain spaces, activities with a particular gender, and it had a major contribution in restricting many people to follow their desires in life?
Yeah, I think you're talking about what is called gender roles, where women are expected to do certain things and men are expected to do certain things, but and other genders that might be expected to do other things. But that varies a lot. It has varied a lot over time, and it varies a lot in different societies in India, outside India, within India, there are many variations. In some societies, women, like some tribal societies, women do most of the manual work. In others, they don't. Even where women are in many pre-modern societies, women did a lot of the productive work, and when it was home-based productive work, like you're a cobbler, let's say, or you're a weaver, Then the man, the woman, all the children all participate in that. It's household-based protection. So things, it changes with time, and in different places it varies widely. So there isn't one gender role for one gender all over the world or the country. We often tend to make that mistake, to think that women were always working at home and doing the housework while men were working outside. Not the case at all. And still not, it was historically has not been the case everywhere, and even today is not the case everywhere. So yeah.
Okay. In terms of historically accepted social conduct, we see that in Bhakti tradition, a large number of male devotees in their works express themselves as female, yearning for her lover, that is the supreme being. Would you call it a defiance of the worldly labels to aim for a transcendental effect beyond binaries, or does it end up reasserting the labels constructed the patriarchal order through appropriation?
It's not an either or question. It's not, it's either this or that. It's many things, and depending where it is. And also, it's not unique to Bhakti at all. If you look at Christian mysticism, in medieval Christian mysticism, it's called bridal mysticism. When you imagine yourself as the bride of God, whether you're a man or a woman or whatever you may be, transgender, you imagine yourself as the bride of God if you imagine God as male. Or you can imagine yourself as, in India, you can imagine yourself as a friend of God, and particularly Indian version, you imagine yourself as the mother of God. You identify with Yashoda, and God as a playful child, and whom you love unconditionally, as parents love children, are supposed to love children unconditionally. So you can identify as the mother, the friend, the bride, the child. When it's worshipping a goddess, very often you identify as the child of the goddess. The goddess is the mother. So you can identify as many different things, as the lover is the beloved, and that's in Christian mysticism. It's also in Islamic mysticism, where it very often is male-male, where both the beloved and the lover are male. And in Hindu mysticism, yes, it's you can be friends, like Arjuna and Krishna were friends, but also very, very close and very inseparable, and would do anything for each other. So they're both males. They don't have to imagine. Arjuna doesn't, though in a later text, Arjuna does become a female briefly, but not in the Mahabharata. So yeah, there's a whole range of ways you can imagine yourself in relationship to the divine. Yeah, and it doesn't also have to take a form. It can also be formless. You imagine the divine as in everything, and then you are the friend of everything, as the Gita says. You're the friend of all beings, because all of them are divine. So that's another way of doing it. Yeah.
Okay. So, as you see, many couples prefer binding themselves together in traditional ways in terms of marriage, which is why there's also a petition to allow same-sex marriage in India, currently pending in Delhi High Court. While defying established societal norms, at the same time, there's an attempt to give relationship a traditionally defined labels. How do you explain this juxtaposition?
First, I don't know what a traditionally defined label is, because marriage has changed drastically over the centuries and is still changing. So in some societies, marriage was where the man owns everything, the man even kind of owns the woman. And that has all obviously changed: property rights, custodial rights, everything. So marriage today is unrecognizable if you were to compare it to marriage, say, even 500 years ago or even 100 years ago. So it's not the same thing. You might use the same word, marriage, but it's completely transformed if you compare it to marriage in the Bible or marriage in the Hindu epics, or marriage, even as I said, 100 years ago. It's changed completely. And when you have, when same-sex couples get married, it is making it something else. We used to have, some societies are polygamous, some are polyandrous, some are monogamous, some are, I mean, they say they're monogamous. So there's this whole range of types of marriage, right? So I wrote this book, Love's Right, and it was published in 2005, so that's a long time ago. And it's called Love's Right, Same-Sex Marriage. And it's based on the fact that from 1980 onwards, I had been collecting newspaper reports of young couples, same-sex couples, running away together, either getting married by religious rituals, or mostly Hindu rituals, or by committing joint suicide together and leaving suicide notes saying bury us or burn us together. And some of these cases became famous, some were not. They were all over India. And the most interesting thing to me about them was that these were low middle or working class women, poor low income women, who, mostly women, there were some men, low income couples, non-English speaking, young. And also they had no contact with any movement. This idea of getting married to each other came to them just from their own feelings, or from where. I was looking for the source of where did this idea come of either marriage or death, but it did not come from any movement. Most of them didn't know any word like gay or lesbian or feminist or anything. They had no contact with any movement, and yet they did the same thing all over the country, in Nepal too, not just in India, but in various places, in small towns, in villages. They were fisherwomen, they were farm workers, they were students, they were nurses, they were all kinds of people, women. And in many cases, the other interesting thing was that in most cases, the families, of course, disapproved at first. In some cases, the families violently separated them and tried to marry them off to men. But in other cases, the families actually came around. They actually, after discussing the whole thing, they came around and they actually helped to arrange the marriage, the wedding. In one case, the case of Jaya and Tanuja, in 1987, I think it was, I'm not sure the exact date, but late 80s or early 90s in Patna, the family actually arranged the marriage of the two women, and at the same time, one of the women's sister got married to a man in a joint ceremony performed by a Hindu priest with 200 guests. So that was extraordinary to me. Like, what were these families? How did they come? These are just regular, ordinary families. They are not exceptionally liberal or progressive or anything. And so I interviewed, and other journalists also interviewed some of the priests who performed these marriages and asked them, what were you thinking? And they gave extremely interesting answers. And not only them, but even other friends of the family, like in one case, a neighbor of a family said, where in the scriptures is it said that it has to be a man and woman getting married? Marriage is the union of spirits to Atman. And so why can't two women get married? But very interesting answers were given. So what I'm trying to say is that the desire, when you say it's a traditional label, the desire to be in a couple, whether you like it or not, or whether we like it or not, or we approve or disapprove, doesn't matter. Most human beings want to be in couples. Now call it marriage, call it by any other name. They want to be in couples. And there are some who don't want to be, so they of course don't have to be forced to be. But most human beings do end up living in couples, and that's true all over the world and through history. But that's the case. Polygamy and polyamory is apart. Now the point is that once they settle down together, they want community, they need community support, without which no one can live. And then in the modern world, the state, the government gives so many rights to people who are married, and doesn't give those rights to people who you may be living together for 20 years. But if you're two women, you're not going to get any of those rights. But if you're married just overnight, today you get married, tomorrow you're a man and woman, you have a whole range of rights, which you don't even think about, because you take it for granted that this is my husband, my wife, we can get a visa, we can get we can open a joint account, we can buy a house together. You think if he is ill, I go to the hospital and I am the most important person to make the decisions. You never think about these rights, you take it for granted. And so it's easy to talk about traditional and non-traditional. The fact is, it's not about tradition, it's about real everyday life, where you want your everyday rights, and that is what people want. So whether or not the movement or the leaders or anyone wants it, even in America, for example, where the gay marriage movement started, it was not started by the movement. The movement leaders were not in favor of it. For one thing, they thought it was too soon to make this demand. For another thing, they thought what you were just saying, that it's patriarchal and heterosexist, and why should we get into this institution? It was ordinary people. In 1975, it was two men who who went and got themselves registered as getting married. And there was a whole case around that. So as early as 1975. After that, when that law actually changed, it was a law filed by two women. They just filed it against the advice of the movement leaders. So if it's a movement that arises from what is called the grassroots. It arises from people, not from movements. This desire for marriage equality comes, I think, from ordinary people who are living together and are not getting the rights which they should from living together. And that is why, hence the court cases that are being filed. Yeah.
But I think the anecdote that you gave of Patna back in in the 1980s, that is so remarkable. And I it's so surprising for me, that the amount of acceptance of people, and just seeing them just as a couple, like two individuals who want to be together, are in love and want to be together. That is so remarkable. And something that honestly,
in this book, another wonderful case I wrote about, and is this two tribal women in Northeast Northeast India. Tingring is the name of one, the others I forget, but it's in the book. They were persecuted in their own village and they had to leave. They went and settled in another village, and they lived there for many years together, and they got the respect of the whole community. And then the community actually asked the candidate, the local candidate who was standing for election, they said that our demand is give these two women, this is long ago, this is in the early 2000s, give these women the rights that they should have because they are a member of our community. Why don't they have any rights? And the candidates had to say, okay, we will consider it. And these women were interviewed by a journalist, and they talked about living together. They are farm workers. They're very low income, as the whole village is. So that's another example. There are many examples of that kind of local and community acceptance, even though the government doesn't accept. Of course, there are also lots of cases of family persecuting the two women and forcibly separating them and driving them to suicide. There are cases of male couples also being driven to suicide by the families. So both happen. Yeah.
Okay. So you have endeavored from the beginning to combine scholarly research with grassroots activism. In this regard, what is your take on Bollywood attempting to educate the audience on LGBTQ issues? Now, Bollywood is this one very strong medium in India, and there has been like there has been a long I don't want to say progress because there's still a long way to go, but the manner in which the LGBTQ community was represented on cinema has changed. Do you think it will have an impact on the audience vis-a-vis the ordinary citizens of this country?
Yeah, definitely. I wrote this book. It's not on LGBTQ, but it's called Courtesans in Bombay Cinema, in which I have one chapter on the men, the male friends of the courtesans and their very interesting relationships and so on. So yes, I think a film like Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan, which I thought was wonderful, both in itself and also because it acknowledged the earlier films that had talked about, that had shown close male-male relationships, whether it was Dosti or Sholay or so many other films where you see men as inseparable friends singing songs to each other in a way that is not found in any other world cinema. And I call it not Bollywood but Bombay cinema, because Bollywood suggests it's an imitation of Hollywood, which it's not, because there are unique features in Indian cinema. For example, this close male-male friendship. It's not found in this form anywhere else. The courtesan character, the courtesan character, the Tawaif character, is unique to Bombay cinema and very, very important, but not there in any other body of world cinema. And the songs, of course, having so many songs in a movie, that's unique to Indian cinema. So yes, I think that has an impact that is immeasurable, that cannot be measured. And the gay community, that at least as far as I know, the gay male community and even the gay female community has been very into Bombay cinema from much before, from the 70s and so on. For various reasons, but one is the sort of the emphasis that it places upon love of any kind, whether you call it romantic friendship or love. It isn't just heterosexual love, but all kinds of love that Bombay cinema thinks is good and shows as good, depicts as good. And I think a film like Shubh Mangal Zyada Savdhan or the other films that have come out, a mainstream film, will have much more impact than many other things, because so many people see it. And over time, if there are more such films made, it will shape especially young people and even older people's way of looking at things.
I think just like sharing my personal anecdote, I remember when going to so the entire extended family going to watch Kapoor and Sons together, and the entire conversation that happens at the end about Fawad Khan's character and it being closeted and like having a gay member in the family, like who like it did initiate a conversation, and it was quite an important conversation for at least my family to have. And when you see those characters on screen, like they are no longer just caricatures, they are real people, and you recognize them as real people. So I think, yeah, like I completely agree with you. Cinema does hold a very strong impact on the minds of the people in understanding that these are not just things on screen. These are real people with real stories to share. Okay. Mm-hmm. What, in your view, could be the reason for suppressing the research on the open acceptance and broad-mindedness of our traditional societies, even in highest academic circles? Now, in most university curriculum, there is an abject dearth of queer literature, and even if it is present, there are radical texts that are foregone in favor of a more socially appeasing structure. Do you believe such politics of discretion is underway, or do you actually see an adequate improvement in academic circles towards the acceptance of the LGBTQ community?
I think there's been an astonishing change. Many universities now have sexuality studies of some kind, definitely gender studies, sexuality studies of some kind. The Delhi University syllabus includes a number of texts. And when I was a student in the 80s and 70s, late 70s, uh, texts like E.M. Forster, Shakespeare, etc., Auden, W.H. Auden were taught without ever mentioning the fact that these were gay writers and or bisexual, whatever they were writers. It was never mentioned. And now that is not anymore the case. It will be difficult because people know, and that's not how it's done. And when I published my first book in 1996, Sappho and the Virgin Mary, Same-Sex Love and English Literary Imagination, I remember that my professor, I went back to Delhi University, my professor, I was teaching there at the time, he actually put the cover up on the notice board. So I think there was a certain liberal kind of, liberal in its older sense or in its classical sense of acceptance of a range of variety of things. It's just that it was not done. And now that it is done, I haven't noticed, I've been asked to speak at so many universities, even small universities, now that it's on Zoom in North Bengal, etc. So people are pretty open to listening and everything. I think things are changing rapidly in the academy, not necessarily everywhere else, but yeah.
Okay, so because you just mentioned this, so I would like to share like a very small anecdote, like very quickly. So I was a student of Delhi University as well. I did history in Ramjas. I graduated in 2016, and actually one of the lectures that I first attended, like on LGBTQ, was conducted by the English Literature department. And I think like that was like the moment, like that was it was my, I think it was my first month in college. And until the time you're in school, so you're sort of in a cocoon, like you don't know, like you don't have a lot of opinions, you're not aware about a lot of things. At least I wasn't. And like college, and especially Ramjas English department, gave me that sort of exposure into so many areas. And the understanding and acceptance of the LGBTQ was one of them. So yeah, like I'm really glad that it happened, and the academic circle did provide me that level of
Yeah,
understanding.
there's been a sea change from the 70s to now. There's been a sea change, a huge change, and this mirrors the earlier change which I've written about in the 1820s, for example, poets and writers up to the 1820s, from the Mahabharata and the Kama Sutra till the 1820s. Indians were freely writing about, discussing all kinds of desire and love, including same-sex desire, very openly. And this changes after 1857 and the British take over, and then it becomes silenced and unspeakable until I would say the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 90s it begins to change. And then when I was in the women's movement, for example, it was not talked about at all within the movement even. And now that has changed so greatly. So there's been one change of 150 years from the 1820s to the 70s, 80s, and then from the 90s to now again, there's another change. So yeah, things keep changing.
So just in relation to the statement that you just made, do you think that the sort of modernization that the British wanted to bring in this country, like the manner in which they used to refer to Indians as primitive and barbaric, but things were made far more regressive socially, especially for the LGBTQ communities. The sort of societal acceptance that used to be there was sort of taken away. So do you think this level of like quote unquote modernization that they wanted to bring actually made things worse compared to, like, again, quote unquote, the primitiveness that we had?
Well, in this book, I have argued that the culture of North Indian cities like Lucknow and like Delhi was a modernity, a pre-colonial modernity. It had all the features, many features of modernity, like consumerism, like hybridity, like free discussion of sexuality, like and so on, which changes after the British. When you say, I wouldn't agree that all British people thought India was primitive and backward. A lot of them, in great admiration, people like Sir William Jones greatly admired India's very developed literary tradition, and then there were those who thought certain aspects of it were primitive and backward, like they thought Hinduism with image worship and so on is backward. But they changed the idea of modernity keeps changing. So when you're talking about the British in the 19th century, you're talking about Victorians, Puritans, who were used in their own society. Male homosexuals were being stoned to death, were being put in the pillory and executed and so on until early 19th century, and continued to be persecuted even after that. So that was their view then. By the 1960s, the British had changed their idea of modernity, but then they got rid of the anti-sodomy law, and they changed. Whereas they had instituted that law in the colonized countries, not just in India, but in all the colonized countries. So the ideas of modernity and a society keep changing, and India had one kind of pre-colonial modernity, and with the British, we then internalized a kind of self-hatred. I would say about all Hindus and Muslims, there was a hatred of the earlier literature that was much more open about many things, not just about same-sex love, but sex in general, pleasure in general, fun, play, wine, love, all this kind of gets sidelined, and you turn all your literature into, you focus on mysticism instead of, and not on, and you remove the poetry that is more about everyday life. And that's what this book was about. It's talking about the kind of Urdu poetry that was not all about dying and pining and being separated, but also about having fun, about shopping, about going out, about friendships, about love affairs, etc. All kinds of love affairs and so on. So ideas of modernity keep changing. There was, at that time, Indians having been defeated in 1857, North Indians felt that they must change themselves and become more masculine and less effeminate. And maybe their literature was making them effeminate, and they should become more masculine in order to be able to fight against colonialism. That was one tendency, that Indian social reformers and nationalists, they become ashamed of their own religions, of their own practices, of their own sexual practices, and they try to change themselves to become like Victorian ladies and gentlemen. But that changes again after, it begins to change again later. Now then they develop this, develops this silly idea that homosexuality is an import from the West, because we are cut off, a lot of us who are educated in English were cut off from our own literature. We had never read the Kama Sutra, we had heard of it, but we had never read it. Most of us, we know the story of the Mahabharata, we haven't really read the whole thing. And so we don't know what's in there. We only know the kind of abridged versions that we are used to. And so we think these homosexuality or many other things are an import from the West, which they are not. But when you read your own literature, you educate yourself and realize that it was homophobia, modern homophobia, that was the import from the West, not homosexuality itself. Yeah.
Thank you so very much for doing this. I can't thank you enough.